Now, this is always risky saying intertestamental period. That's very Protestant language, right? Because actually, there is actually those deuterocanonical books there that are part of our Bible. But if you're engaged in Protestant speak, this is where the Apocrypha comes in to talk about this period between what in a Christian Bible is the end of Malachi, the end of the Hebrew Bible, and the beginning of the Greek New Testament. You've got these Greek Bible, Greek additions to the Old Testament that survived from the Septuagint. But we will call this the community of return, or better than intertestamental period. The current term is Second Temple, and this is when it's proper to talk about Judaism. What you have before the exile is distinct in a socio-religious and biblical theological sense from the Judaism that we really associate with the second period. So if you want to talk about this up here as Yahwism, or Old Testament ancient Israelite religion. I mean, there's several little bits of lingo that kind of goes by, but it's important to make that distinction, just as a way of being kind of culturally accurate. So
Michael, we should say that. I mean, in a sense, Judaism forms as a result of what happens in the Babylonian exile and after that, right? Because there's no temple, so they have to figure out this other thing.
Well, and of course they do rebuild the temple,
right?
But what makes Judaism makes Judaism is this. I think. I mean, there's a number of ways you can sort of skin this particular cat. I mean, whether it's a renewed sense of the centrality of Torah that gives rise to much later the Tanaic rabbinic tradition that gives you the Mishnah and then the Talmud and all of that, the halakha stuff, or you can talk about it as more of a socio-cultural sense of identity. That this new sense of whatever we were before was as a matter of history and as a matter of culture was certainly a much more diversified. And what you have is a kind of refinement and reduction in what it means to be in covenant with Yahweh. And so that bit in Deuteronomy the bit about during the days of Josiah, them finding the law in a wall, and reclaiming Torah as sort of a badge of Israelite identity, and a real sense of hard distinction between Israel and the Goyim and the nations, and wanting to really rigidly maintain and police that sense of boundary, police it in terms of circumcision, police it in terms of Sabbath obedience, police it in terms of diet, in terms of who we marry, who we have commerce with. So it's certainly religious at its root, but it's social-cultural, and all other ways. And so there's an opaque wall between these two things, but it's probably wise to think about that wall as something pretty close.
Synagogue life.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, certainly synagogue life. So in the way to think about this, just as a matter of saying this popularly when you have a conversation with somebody, the end of the Hebrew Bible, you ask, who the heck's in charge here? You're going to do something like kings, priests, prophets, and sages. So you got the wisdom literature hanging out there, and then the prophet, priest, king thing. you open up onto the experience of Judaism, and if you didn't have those apocryphal books or the Deuterocanon, you wake up in the Gospels and you've got Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots. Who are these people? Well, who are these people? Are the product of Judaism. Perushim, the Pharisees, are a peasant class that's super heavy duty, devoted to Torah. The Sadducees have a different relationship with the pagan nations. They're much more centrally located around temple life rather than Torah and synagogue life. Of course, the Essenes, we know about them by rumors in Josephus until we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they're Israel in exile. And it's a self-imposed exile because they think that the temple and all of the Judaism in Jerusalem is corrupt, and so the Essenes think of themselves as the guys hanging on to the rim of the toilet. When the world gets flushed down the toilet, they're going to be the only Israel that's left, right? Because they remained in exile. And of course, the Zealots had their own kind of radical approach to all of this. You have the Zealots and the little band of Sicarii that were interested in ginning up a war that looked to them like a new Maccabean kind of revolt. And so the Sicaries, they were dagger men. And basically, what they would do is they would knife people in the city square and trying to provoke conflict.
Were the Zealots the one that took care of the temple of Masada? Were those Zealots?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You right.
Yeah.
Well, and this is what ends up happening, and it's a way of kind of understanding what's going on in the New Testament with Jesus and the disciples. I mean, Jesus is warning of this horrendous, thing that's going to happen. The apocalyptic passages in Matthew's gospel are predicting this dire thing that war's coming with the pagans because you're ginning it up. And Jesus is opting and advocating for a very different kind of rivalry. So a lot of this ends up down here at the big pivotal question that comes after the exile and that dominates the conversation during the entire Second Temple period down to AD 70. When the temple is destroyed by the Romans, is the question of how Israel relates to the Goyim, how Israel relates to the nations, and what it ends up being is a variation on that supersession versus dispensationalism option. That for Israel to be Israel, the Goyim have to go away. Or they have to maintain a rigid distinction between Israel and the Goyim. And to really think about Israel and the nations being something that is that relationship is necessarily characterized by a competition. And Jesus is about something very different. So let me take just a few minutes and start to sketch this out and develop how some of this stuff, I think it develops. And I don't think that it's always easy or obvious to spot this as the Old Testament tells its own story. Because the Hebrew Bible is full of lots of variations and different theologies operative within them. But I really do think that if we're going to read the Hebrew Bible and receive our Yahwist roots and really honor our connection to the ancient people of God, that we need to approach that connection Christologically, and this is the language of the book of Hebrews speaking here, saying in many ways God spoke to his people in ancient past, but in this day and age he has spoken to us by his Son. Paul saying that he is the exact representation of God. That if we're going to understand who God is, the only way for a Christian to properly access the question of who God is and who the God is that is speaking to us in the whole of the Scriptures is Jesus. So that if you've got a way of understanding God, even if it emerges in some ways from the Hebrew Bible that looks different from Jesus, chances are you've misread. Is kind of the way. So I want to sketch it out like this. So let's start talking about this relationship between Israel and the nations by going all the way back to the primeval period. Why in the world do you have this 11-chapter prelude to the story of Abraham in Genesis chapter 1, or in Genesis chapter 12? What goes on in Genesis 1 through 11? Genesis 1 and 2 are what? Creation, right? Genesis 3, fall, all right? Genesis 4, Cain and Abel. Then all of a sudden, Katie barred the door and the world starts to unspool, right? So you get down into this dire situation where it's every thought and every inclination of every man's heart is only evil all the time. That's how you tee up the ball to begin the story of the flood, right? And God says, as it were, in the flood narrative, if Cain can kill Abel, maybe I can get in the killing business too. And you see God wiping out everything except one small group of people and a bunch of animals. And then you ask the question, well, did the flood work? No, because even God can't kill enough people to deal with sin, because sin is not operative only outside the ark. It's operative inside the ark too, and in the heart of every individual that was there within the ark. And then they spill out. Noah does the first good thing that he can think of, and that's plant a vineyard, make wine, get hammered drunk, and the language of cursing returns to the scene in Genesis, because Abraham's son Ham is being cursed, right? And then, the whole thing starts to unspool again, and pagans are making temples, and a Tower of Babel begins to form. And then you get the Table of Nations in chapter 11, and then the story of Abraham starts. So what's the point of those 11 chapters? What do you think?
To show that men are ultimately sinful.
All right.
That's just a guess.
I think the pervasive nature of sin, for certainly, and it's stubborn. It's why, and I've got a little bit of it, and you probably heard it even in the way that I spoke of it. That I have a way of reading the flood narrative, and I think that the flood narrative, if you read it sort of, as this is genuinely the way God behaves, is deeply problematic for any number of reasons. Number one, it was a terrible plan that failed. The whole flood blew up.